Wonder Woman voice was a bit strange at the end. Okay, we'll crack on. I'm just conscious of the lady at the back who's not coming, but she might join us in a bit. Quite looking forward to today, because now, as I said, building on what we've done up to this week, now we're getting to a real kind of specialist area. And this is my specialist area. I think I've mentioned to you before. When I was at what it was called the University of Wales Institute, Cardiff. It's a precursor to what they call Cardiff Met now. It's basically a sports-centred university over in Cardiff, obviously hotbed of rugby. I was training to be a PE teacher, but then I realised in my first year, I think it was, that looked like damn hard work, and I thought, well, the guys at the front, they've got a decent gig. You know, they don't teach so much, and they travel around the world at conferences, and they write books, or some of them, of course. And so I thought maybe that was the level of teaching I wanted to do. So at that stage, as you remember, the dentist, I'd come down to South Africa, and South Africa had inspired me, and I ended up doing this as my dissertation. Now I was a bit older, so it would have been a bit odd for an 18-year-old to pick up this subject, but maybe not. I was 27 when I kind of got my head around this subject. I had a supervisor at Cardiff who was a big rugby fan, but didn't really know much about the South African context. So it was left to me to come down here and get all my primary data, etc. But I was fascinated for the reasons I've probably talked about, of how this game was embraced by this country, or has been embraced by this country, but particularly by the Afrikaners within South Africa. My inspiration, of course, came from here. Stellenbosch. Barney Craven Stadium, the tradition of rugby, of course. Proud rugby club. We saw that one of the earliest rugby clubs yesterday was created at Stellenbosch. It is entrenched in the folklore of that place, and of course we know Stellenbosch has that strong Afrikaner connection. In fact, when I was there in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I'm not exaggerating, it was quite unusual for an Englishman to be studying at Stellenbosch. It was to my advantage, of course. I thought I was a bit of a novelty. I got a load of stick. I mean, they called me various names. I learned all the swear words in Afrikaans, what they were talking about, but there was a respect. I remember I was at Kutzenberg and I was doing some football coaching, so I was kind of studying there, eventually doing a master's degree and a PhD, but I was also doing some teaching as well. So I was a little bit older, and I remember once I was sitting in the class and the lecturer started speaking English for the first time, a very Afrikaans chap, and why? And he said, blame the Englishman, blame the Englishman. And that was incredible. When I think back, now they wouldn't probably do that because it's not such a novelty to have foreign students there. So I learned all about the passion for rugby amongst the Afrikaans group, amongst my friends who just treated this game like a religion. It was part of their growing up, it was part of their initiation. Whether you played for the first 15 or whether you played for the house thirds team or seconds, the social team, you were involved in the game in some way at Stellenbosch. And that's what led me to start digging deeper. As I said, the inspiration for that dissertation was because I knew a little bit about my South African history, and I was obviously aware of the tensions that had existed between the English speakers, or the English, shall we say, per se, the British and the Afrikaners throughout their history. So why would they adopt this game and make it so much part of their culture? And that's why I started to do this. And there was one paper by a chap called Professor Albert Groenlin, who's now the head of, or the ex-head of history at Stellenbosch, and he had talked about this idea of Afrikaner nationalism and rugby, how basically rugby was adopted at the same time that the sort of in the 20s and 30s, in the 20th century, when this Afrikaner nationalism was rising pre-Second World War, and of course prior to the National Party getting in 48. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And really, this is a good example of a paper that involves looking beyond the try line. And it's the rivalry, of course. I mean, blood and guts, that's old school rugby, isn't it? I mean, look at the ball, for example, but here we have a picture of the Springboks against their old adversary, the British Lions, back in the day. And it's that really fascinates me, that this population group on the southern tip of Africa took up this most British of games. And I've explained that it has got a very much a political link to the British Empire. It's not just hearsay, it was created in the English public schools. So it is the game of English gentlemen, yet it's being played with such passion down here in South Africa. So before we start, let's just put it in context. I mean, this is something, well, South Africa today has a population of 58 million plus, and we know why I put the plus, because I don't think we know what the population is, really. I mean, it's probably a lot more. There's the official population. Yet we do know the white population is a small percentage of that. I mean, less than 10% now. I think the latest figures were 8%, if not slightly less. So, if half of that group approximately are Afrikaans, that is the question. Why and how did Afrikaners become the dominant force in South African rugby history? And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at that. So if I may, I'm going to read and ad-lib as we go along. I've got a lot of images for you to bring the thing to life, but I just want to keep the narrative clear so I can follow a script, as it were, today. Because you know me, I like talking, and I'd probably go off script and miss some important facts. So we talked about nationalism, as you remember. That's an important part of sport for me. Sport is an important part of nationalism. According to Kutzer, an academic, he says, nationalism is an ideology, a pattern of thought, at the centre of which lies a certain principle, idea or phenomenon. This principle provides man, and I quote, with a sense of worth, of significance, security, safety, happiness, tranquility, peace, freedom and hope for the future. Afrikaner nationalism, it could be argued, emerged because of such needs. Striving for self-determination, constitutional reform was sought by Afrikaners to escape the effects of imperialism imposed by the British. Following the Anglo-Boer War, I will refer to it as the Anglo-Boer War if you don't mind today, but we know it in different guises, the Boer War, the South African War, and gaining momentum throughout the 30s and 40s, nationalism began to awaken a large number of Afrikaners who set out to gain an independent state within which their characteristics, values and interests would be secure. Now this quote from Thatcher, there's been a lot of studies of the rise of Afrikaner nationalism, but I think that sums it up in terms of this tension between the Afrikaans and the British at the time. The greatest threat to the Afrikaner did not come from any group native to Africa, but rather from Europe. The English brought with them a culture that, in relation to that of the Afrikaner, was undeniably superior. So this tension between cultures was there from the start. We know that sport played an integral part in this process of nationalism, in its capacity to give meaning to life, to create and interconnect senses of achievement and identity. Sport, according to Lincoln Allison, as a complex and important interaction with nationality and the phenomenon of nationalism. So for Afrikaners, sport, and as we see today, rugby in particular, has served a definite purpose within the pursuit of that identity. So I believe that even for today, for those people arriving in South Africa, there is still a sense of history unfolding in this country. I mean, how many times have we said we're at a crossroads? It has been called the so-called Rainbow Nation to recognise the variety of cultures that we have in this country. But as we concern ourselves with the ongoing question of race relations within the country, just over a century ago, a war raged that was the pinnacle of a dispute in the troubled relations between the two white groups, the Afrikaner and the British. So marked by its centenary back in 1999, the Boer War, or South African War as I said, it's been commonly known as more recently, represents a topical yet highly significant phase in South African history. So today we'll continue to look at rugby beyond the try-line. We will explore the very nature of this Anglo-Boer relation, the conflict that it created and the antagonisms between those two groups, and the way it played a part in an essential part in the creation of a post-war nationalist Afrikaner identity. We'll also look at the origins of rugby in South Africa, which we've done previously, but we'll touch on that again, but especially how this game in particular, entrenched, remember, as it is an imperial white ideology, and that's why I set the scene over the first 2 days here, was embraced by Afrikaners during this period and used as a separate source of cultural identity to challenge the very empire that had given birth to the game in the first place. So several studies have attempted to clarify the relationship that existed between the English and the Afrikaner during the 19th century. Notably, Streak in 1974 suggested the relationship hinged on the conflict between liberalism and conservatism, and not simply a barrier dividing the colonial South from the Republican North. Religious beliefs played an integral part in this. On the one hand, you had the liberalism of the English, whilst on the other you had the conservatism of the essentially rural Afrikaner people who based their religious traditions on Calvinism and strong Protestant faith. Indeed, when the English first landed in 1795, they came from a background of empire builders, and not surprisingly this clashed with the interest of the Boers. It was the pioneers of South Africa held an outlook of an essentially conservative society. So any attempts by the British to integrate the Afrikaners into their own religious sanctums were heavily rejected, as this also meant accepting the king and the empire as part of God's plan for salvation. This man's significant, of course, in South African history, Jan Smuts. As late as 1929, I'm sure you're aware of the role this man played within the Anglo-Boer War. He was in command of his own commando on the side of the republics. Later, he would switch sides. He would see the greater good of bringing the two white races together. But as late as 1921, I think this is a really poignant statement about the war. The Boer War, according to Smuts, was other than most wars. It was a vast tragedy in a people whose human interest far surpassed its military value. It was an epic struggle between the smallest and the greatest of peoples. Now, there's probably one of your history's finest diplomats paying his homage to both sides. But it just gives a sense of how, even in 1929, people were still looking about that period from 1899 to 1902 when the conflict was raging, how important it was in the psyche of South Africa. So, as I mentioned, the war which broke out, I'm sure you all know, in October 1899 was an expensive venture for British imperialism. If I can just sum it up, 450,000 troops were sent to South Africa, of whom over 20,000 lost their lives. It cost the British taxpayer £250 million to secure the interests of the mining magnates in a land where the entire white population of the Transvaal in 1899, for example, was less than the population of Sheffield. Subsequently, to many at home in Britain, the significance of such a small nation was largely irrelevant to the good of the empire. However, British prestige was about to suffer incalculable damage, for the war was fought with the utmost barbarity. Poor women and children were confined in concentration camps, their homes and farms destroyed before they could be brought to surrender, while the gallantry and guerrilla strategy of the Afrikaners, a small nation defying the world's greatest imperial power at that time, in defence of their independence, won them the admiration and support of the democratic world. Regarded now as crucial to the development of Afrikaner nationalism and thus a pivotal focus of this study, the war at the time was, however, the ultimate frustration for the Afrikaners. The 19th century had proved to be a period of sparring, of jockeying for position between the British and the Boer, especially here in the Cape, at a time when the Cape had been abandoned to imperial control with hardly a struggle. As we know, in the 1830s, what is now famous, the Great Trek into the interior. So it was a case of you either accepted British control and regulation and sovereignty, or you moved into the interior. So now, following the war, the Afrikaners had been chastised on their own home soil, and they could see nowhere else to go. However, what the war achieved, and as I'll show you today, was a singleness of purpose in Afrikaner thinking. A unity developed and only deepened the division between Britain and Afrikaner. It was a unity that would ultimately lead to the dominance of Afrikaner views on race, society, politics and rugby throughout South Africa. In war as in peace, the two nations behaved in stark contrast. Against the trained military force there stood a people's army of farmers, clerks, schoolmasters and students. The Boers formed naturally into small commandos which were mobile, swift-moving, independent and could blend into the civilian population at will. And here we have a Boer commando waiting for the British to advance over the veldt. Looks slightly different from their adversaries at the top. The British, on the other hand, advanced across the veldt in serried rank, waiting for set-piece battles that never happened. They became increasingly demoralised by an enemy that killed without being seen. The whole study of the war, the way it was fought, of course, is highlighted in famous books like Thomas Packenham's The Boer War, etc. The British soldiers, who may not have understood or even cared for the high-minded principles of imperialism for which they fought, were thrust up against determined and desperate Afrikaners who were indeed fighting for their land and for their existence. Early Republican triumphs were met by the inexorable sweep of the imperial armies, whose superior numbers and military might eventually began to tell, against the stubborn resistance of the Boers. At the height, we were looking at a force, as I said, numbering 400,000. At the height, Afrikaners, there's estimates either way, we looked at a force of no more than 80,000. So in terms of numbers, perhaps it was inevitable that this conflict was going to end one way. The surprise, of course, for many back in Britain and many confident imperialists was it went on for so long. Despite the early reverses, the conflict was set to continue through a gallant and ultimately futile Boer campaign of guerrilla warfare. Ominously, though, it was against this that Britain was to employ a new set of tactics that would, and I quote de Villiers, cause scars where they were hardest to heal on the bruised psyche of a whole people. Lord Kitchener, the British military commander, proposed to terrorise the Republican forces into surrender. In his opinion, the Boers were, and I quote, uncivilised Afrikaner savages who needed to be dealt with by the utmost severity. So he mandated camps of concentration for families of men still on commando to encourage those men to surrender. However, the concentration camps, as we now know, proved disastrous. Largely from incompetence, thousands of women and children died. So when the war ended in May 1902, just over 3,000 Boer troops died in battle. By a standing contrast, according to British sources, 18,000 women and children died in the camps, though the Boers, of course, claimed the figure was nearer 26,000 dead. In London, Lord George accused the British government of pursuing, and I quote, a policy of extermination. Whilst condemnation of the revised strategy began to flood in from around the world, the Irish, the Germans, the French, traditional rivals with England, meant that they sided with the Boers. They believed that the war in the camps would be nothing but an exercise of oppression and aggression. The Dutch, in particular, considering the war in the light of race sympathy, were unqualified in their condemnation of it. So clearly the plight of the Afrikaner and their fight for survival had raised their profile around the globe. Any hopes of peace, however, were blighted by a lack of dialogue between the two parties. The British colonial government, with its intractable classist bias, still held the Boers up to ridicule and contempt. And I think this, you can find so many examples of the kind of attitude that was being portrayed, or the propaganda, should I say, at that time. And when I was doing my studies, this was the kind of language that was being used. A.B. Patterson, writing in the Sydney Morning Herald, of course, this was an empire war, so the Australians were certainly involved, as I said, in terms of a fighting force, along with the New Zealanders, the Canadians, etc. He says, on November the 30th at Cape Town, I met my first Boer prisoner of war. He's a doctor, holding an English degree, and can make a 50 break at billiards. Apparently these Boers are at any rate partially civilised. He evidently looks on us as less civilised than his own people, the poor fish. The patronising kind of condescending way in which the Afrikaans or the Boers were actually perceived. Because, as historians have said since, to fight any war you have to create an enemy, you have to create another. And for the first time the British were fighting, not obviously fighting on the African continent. It was slightly different, this, of course, than the Anglo-Zulu War that had just happened 10 years or so earlier. There you were fighting savages, you were fighting Africans, you were fighting people of a different race and culture. Now you were fighting basically people with a European heritage. So you had to create this idea that they were less civilised. So to meet a doctor and to speak in those condescending terms is quite incredible. The two sides were still worlds apart in terms of understanding each other, and the divisions the war had deepened would continue long after peace was achieved in 1902. So for many Afrikaners, there could be no question of conciliation with the English, while the memories of 1899 to 1902 and the concentration camps were still fresh in their minds. And I quote, only by stressing their ethnic identity could the humiliation of defeat and the cultural chauvinism of the English be overcome. Rugby, as this study will show, was one such vehicle used during this period to articulate Afrikaner identity. The former Northern Transvaal and Springbok fly half Nas Botha back in 1994 that rugby in South Africa is to a great extent the Afrikaners game. Certainly the importance of rugby in Afrikaner society and the significant influence that the Afrikaners have had on the development of rugby in South Africa cannot be denied. But as we've seen this week, the early origins of rugby, like the history of rugby around the world, as here in South Africa, is all part of this imperial heritage. So we were looking at places like New Zealand, Australia, and we could see the same pattern occurring here. That's why today I will explore the reasons why Afrikaners attach their own special and cultural meanings to the game, and how, in its formative years, it was used as an expression of identity, a counter-hegemonic tool against British imperialism. There's been much speculation as to why Afrikaners actually developed an almost mystical identification with rugby. Like cricket, it was a colonial game, and as we saw yesterday, rugby was brought to South Africa in 1861 by Canon George Ogilvie, who played the game at Winchester College. Its popularity spread, and a year later, the first report of a football match, as we saw yesterday, appeared in 1862, when a civil service team played a British military team. Would you believe it ended 0-0? Surprising that game took off. On Tuesday, we looked at how the growth of empire during this period had meant the British forms of leisure and sport were being introduced to local cultures across the globe. Of course, the situation in Africa was no different, so by 1890, the foundations of rugby was laid, and in 1891, we see the visit of the first British Lions or the British Isles team. And here we have a rare picture of the first game of the British playing Cape Colony under Table Mountain. 1891, as I said, within a matter of years, this country would be racked by war. But rugby had cemented itself already. And it was the years following the South African War that are important, because at this point, Afrikaners, Africans were all playing rugby alongside English speakers and colonials, as it were. So the war had such an important effect, as you would imagine, on society in South Africa, and it affected the diffusion of sport as well. It was during this period that Britain, in wishing to impose a greater degree of control, actively pursued a policy of cultural imperialism. At that time, when the empire advanced its interests under the banner of development and civilization, the process of indigenous communities still lay in the progress of indigenous communities, should I say, still lay in their assimilation and incorporation into things British. Sport and team games were an integral part of this assimilation process. So before the Anglo-Boer War, rugby was not widely played in other parts. For example, the Transvaal was still to receive great numbers of rugby players. It was even played less so in the Orange Free State. The Cape was the hotbed of rugby at that time, and obviously centres such as Kimberley, where we saw the diamond fields and the diffusion of culture. If we look at Difford's 1933 study, The History of South African Rugby Football, it is evident that institutionalised rugby in the two Boer republics, in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, was only found in city centres and around mining districts, and apparently not at all in country areas. However, following the war and return to normal conditions, there was a great expansion of the game, and in 1903, the touring British team under Mark Morrison, we looked at him yesterday, found the local teams far stronger than ever before. South Africa even won its first Test series, of course, that year with 2 draws and a win. So the progress was there, but still, the Afrikaner republics had not adopted rugby at that stage, even though it was being played widely elsewhere throughout the Cape and other parts of Southern Africa. It was the war that had a particular effect on the spread of the game. Now, scholars such as my old supervisor at Stellenbosch, Floris van der Merwe, looked at the effect of captured Boer fighters in the British prisoner of war camps and how rugby was introduced to them for the first time. It was there that they undertook not only rugby but other sports, association football, cricket, tennis, these kind of sports. And after the war, they went back to their communities, taking those sports with them. Because, of course, that's the one thing the Afrikaners and British had in common, was their love of sport. Sport, as Van der Merwe suggests, came as a natural deliverance from the adversity of the camps. Camps in places as far afield as St. Helena, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, India and Bermuda. What else would you do if you were sent over to these far-off outposts, and basically through boredom, the British captors, the guards, would basically introduce sport as a way of controlling, of course, discipline, etc. And there was evidence of guards versus prisoner games, etc. They were teaching them the British style of sport. In total, 27,000 Boers were captured during the war, and 24,000 of them were actually sent to prisoner of war camps abroad. So this was significant. One report of sporting activity in a prisoner of war camp in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, remarked, and I quote, how rugby football in particular claimed a remarkable measure of enthusiasm, and it was especially noticeable how very keenly the Boer fell to this purely British game. Following the war, the spread of the game was especially noticeable in the rural areas. Under the influence of Boers returning from British prison camps, the popularity of rugby amongst Afrikaners began to emerge. For those Boers who remained on their farms, only two major sports were probably accessible to them, rugby and association football. And of the two, rugby had the advantage perhaps that it could be played more easily on rough and level rural terrain. So but maybe there's a local condition element to this as well. Although I certainly wouldn't like to tackle on some of those pictures that were created. The physical, robust nature of the game may also have appealed to the rural Afrikaner, a theory supported by a number of those I interviewed while doing research for this study. I remember taking a sample of different kind of groups, sports fans, rugby fans, and asking them, why are you so into rugby? Why? I mean, it was probably really poorly researched at the time. But there was this sense that rugby represented the Afrikaner because it was a symbolic significance. Rugby had those kind of values that suited the Afrikaner's spirit. Both the Afrikaner's pioneer spirit in the game had physical values, physical endurance, for example, strength and rapidity, as well as the warrior values of struggle and virility, fellowship and a sense of shared effort. There was something about the essence of rugby that appealed to Afrikaners. However, stamped as it was with the mark of their imperial adversaries, it is still somewhat ironic that rugby appealed to an Afrikaner community that had very little in common with the ideology of English gentlemen. The reason for this, then, surely lies in the game's essential character and the ethos which it acquired during its long history of social transformation. As we have discussed this week, rugby is essentially a team game, a group sport, which values physical endurance, strength, as well as fellowship and shared effort. Perhaps these were the qualities that lent themselves particularly well to appropriation by the Afrikaner. We'll talk more about these tomorrow, but this is the 1906-07 Springboks, the first team that left these shores. And these were significant because not only do they contain players of Afrikaans origin and English-speaking South Africans, but they contain players who had fought against each other in the war just 4 years before. So this was seen as a symbolic tour. And as we saw yesterday, they were not only successful off the pitch in creating a certain positive message, but they were certainly successful on the pitch. Despite the defeat by the Welsh, you could see that this was certainly a case of the pupil now teaching the teacher how to play rugby. But despite the success of this team in the first overseas tour, the popularity of the game fluctuated during the next 15 years, with the increasing trend of urbanisation amongst Afrikaners. Again, urbanisation. We talked about how it affected the evolution of sports back in Britain. Urbanisation and the way people live is such an important catalyst to how sport evolves. But it survived and began to flourish, interestingly enough, in the 1920s, as concerted efforts were made to reach out to young Afrikaners who came from the rural areas into the towns by introducing rugby as a game which could instill discipline and self-confidence. Exactly what the British had done in the public schools. Through the energetic efforts of administrators, many of whom had learned their rugby at Stellenbosch, the game began to diffuse successfully amongst the working class, in a process not dissimilar to what had happened in the United Kingdom during the latter part of the 19th century. Of course, we looked at this during the course. Throughout this period, though, rugby was not yet invested with that narrow, nationalistic Afrikaner ethos. Nevertheless, the fact that the Afrikaners made their mark on the playing field can be seen, in retrospect, to have singled out the game as a sport with the potential to enhance the self-image of the Afrikaner. Years ago, I interviewed the former Springbok and Western Province fullback Darby Snyman, and he remarked how he believed rugby became part of the Afrikaans culture, and I quote, "because of results. It was a place of recognition for Afrikaans people." Now, the interesting thing about Darby, I always remember that, and it taught me a valuable thing about research. I went to school with his, I went to school, I was at university, I was at Kutsenberg with his daughter Patsy, and that's what gave me access to him, because he was very cagey in talking about this, because you can imagine this young Englishman wanted to talk about the divide between Afrikaner and English. It was something he was reluctant to do on tape. Off tape, it was a different case. He talked about the rivalry at school, how they wanted to beat the English at university, how there's an English player adds a bit of edge to the Afrikaans players. I put my tape recorder on and he said, "No, not a problem, it's not a divide." And that told me this was a man who was trained in media, obviously. But without giving too much away, he certainly confirmed the rivalry that perhaps still exists. The successes of the Springboks in world competition between 1903 and 1956, they won all of their test series, soon made rugby the national sport in South Africa. However, during the 1930s, at a stage when the game was predominantly played by Afrikaners, rugby began to shift from a broader imperial focus to a South African nationalist focus, particularly as the Afrikaner Broederbond, the Brotherhood, and the Nationalist Party targeted rugby as a central site for the expression of Afrikaner nationalism. So while the British regarded rugby as part of the imperial sporting ethos as a way of cementing relations within the Commonwealth, Afrikaners viewed the game in explicitly nationalistic and ethnic terms. And it was during the 20s and the 30s where this was emerging. Whereas rugby in Australia and New Zealand expressed some sense of imperial kinship, amongst Afrikaners, Springbok rugby carried a thinly disguised anti-imperialist message. Albert Krunling, as I said, Professor of History at Stellenbosch University. So we can start to think about how this all shapes. When we look at rugby in an arena of heightened nationalism, it did reflect the tension that still existed between the Afrikaner and the Briton. As we see, whereas in other parts of the Commonwealth, rugby was this idea of bringing one together, albeit in friendly rivalry, here in South Africa during the 20s and the 30s, leading up to the Second World War, rugby was being carried along by the forerunners of the Nationalist Party and the emerging influence of the Broederbond to be part of this increasing nationalist overtones to Afrikaner identity. So some people have suggested that during this time, whenever they played the Britons, it was the Anglo-Boer War in explicitly nationalist ethnic terms all over again. The intense rivalry and fierce play that characterised domestic rugby matches between the English and Afrikaans speakers became an expression of the animosity that still existed between the two white factions, certainly from the Afrikaans side. Sadie Berman was an observer at rugby matches between the English Medium University of the Witwatersrand and the Afrikaans University of Pretoria in the 1930s. She remembers it wasn't just rugby they were playing, rather, and I quote, "there was a bitterness and a hatred of each other. The overtones were quite clear. The major goal was to beat the other university, not only in the game. I think the competition between two such universities was naturally bitter, because it was the child of the hatred of the Afrikaans and the English speakers. It certainly didn't dissipate the tension." We look now and we can see how the success of the national team, the Springboks, later in the 50s, we look at the kind of language. The Springboks in 1951 win 30 out of 31 matches on a British tour. It was declared a major national triumph. However, in 1955 they lost 2 tests on the next tour of Britain. They were held for bringing the national game into disrepute. So by the 50s, this game was now the national game. And this idea of being the national game came from the rise of Afrikaner nationalism. As one of the main perpetrators of anti-British sentiment, the Broederbond had a subtle yet profound influence on Afrikaner society. The Broeders, or brothers, served as a crucial link between the National Party and its Afrikaner ethnic constituency, helping to define policy alternatives, mobilise support for new policy initiatives, and to take the pulse of male Afrikanerdom. For this purpose, it sought to recruit the opinion leaders of Afrikaner society, and naturally rugby, with its newfound cultural significance, was to fall under its influence. The Broederbond would look towards leading athletes as sports officials in general, and rugby players and officials in particular. Although Afrikaners had taken to rugby in large numbers, they had yet to capture the administration of the game and dictate its politics. Prior to 1948, control of the game was still largely in English-speaking white South African hands. Thereafter, Afrikaners, principally associated with the Broederbond, undertook a sustained campaign to wrest control for their own. As Wilkins and Straydon testify, Broeders adorn the history of South African rugby. Avril Milan, Johan Klassen, pictured here, Darby de Villiers, Hannes Murray served as Springbok captains. Butch Lochner, pictured here. Pete de Toy, Manikis Roux, Willem Delport played for the Springboks. Sid Kingsley, Fritz Elof, the fine glasses there. Steve Straydon served as presidents of provincial rugby unions. They were all members or active members of the Broederbond. Implicit within the Broederbond strategy was the important motive for nationalist Afrikaners. Unless they had full control of the various bodies involved in rugby, they would be unable to influence the wider social and political dimensions of the sport in South Africa. This, as history testifies, they achieved. The game of rugby, with its distinctly British heritage, had been appropriated by Afrikaners of all levels and used to challenge the imperialist hegemony that had introduced the sport in the first place. Afrikaners had at last discovered their own sporting expression of independence. For Afrikaners, rugby's tradition as a central element of culture indeed had to be invented. Afrikaners largely resisted British imperial culture and ideologies, but ironically, as we have seen, took rugby and imbued it with their own set of meanings, as scholars such as Albert Grunling and Archie Bouillon have also suggested. Certainly events in the 1930s leading up to the Second World War, here in South Africa, one of the Great Trek Centenary, of course, was the height of Afrikaner nationalism. The 1930s and 40s were certainly important years. Afrikaner nationalism at this time can be interpreted as a broad social and political response to the impact of capitalism as well as continued imperial influence in economic and cultural spheres. The Taal, the language, the Calvinist religion, and the heroic suffering of Afrikaans women and children at the hands of the dastardly British during the war were all promoted as part of the heightened Afrikaner nationalism during this period. And of course, the centenary celebrations of the Groot Trek in 1938 became a pivotal point for the movement just prior to the division created by the Second World War. And here we have spin-offs from this, the Osama Brandvac, the Oxwagon Sentinel, very right-wing movement created through national sentiment, anti-British, favouring Germany and its policies during the Second World War. We'd seen this division play out during the First World War as well, which led to armed struggle on the streets. The tension was created, and it came to a head, of course, as a result of the South African War, which started in 1899. The gradual Afrikaner appropriation of the game, of course, was not without paradox. Rugby, having originated in England, epitomised the British upper-middle-class value system, and fundamentally, therefore, should have represented everything that the nationalist Afrikaner opposed. However, as Afrikaners had already proved that they could actually excel at this game, it was practical to adapt and reshape an existing game than to create a pure, separate form of sporting expression themselves. And here we can look at comparisons with the Irish, of course. Nationalist Irish wanted to be, apart from the British, they created their own sporting movement and their own sports. So in other words, we don't even want to play your sport, we don't even want to play with you. But this was slightly different. The Afrikaners took rugby and imbued it with their own values and their own identity. It was now their sport following the election or the success in 1948 of the National Party. So, to sum up, Afrikaners had adopted rugby as a means of heightened expression of their uniqueness and individuality, free from imperial control, and indeed as an opportunity to beat the English at their own game. Within this climate, the game became a powerful disseminator of nationalist sentiment and a source of identification for the Afrikaner population within the racial mix of South Africa. The Afrikaans people, smarting from bitter defeat in a war some years earlier, had at last discovered an ideal vehicle through which they could distance themselves from other sections of South African society. That's the end of the formal part of my paper. I wanted to just put up some reading there as well. And I want to leave some time now for discussion. Any questions, any comments? That was a bit heavier, wasn't it?
It was good. Very good. Musing that out, it would be interesting to track the number of Afrikaans speakers in the Springbok teams from the very first through the 20s, 30s. I guess we would get to a stage where there would probably be 13 out of 15 of them, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, there was always a little sort of tongue-in-cheek thing they said, you know, we would have 14 Afrikaners as long as we had one Jewish player, you know, because they were lucky to have a Jewish player, you know. But yeah, there must have been teams where there were no English players at all, or English speakers in the team.
That would certainly be the case, and we could see that increasing during that period. I mean, the reason why I put those quotes up about the 50s was it was quite obvious now that literally the success of the Springboks was now a reflection on the success of the country and of the regime in charge. And this idea, it was called a national triumph, a national tragedy when they lost, of course, the success of it. The thing that always fascinated me was how this game emerged, or how sports in society, but especially rugby. Rugby was the most obvious that took a different line after the South African War, but it wasn't immediately. And we can make generalisations, which a lot of people do, and say that cricket's the Englishman's game, rugby's the Afrikaner's game, and that's far too general. It's never been the case. We know that all population groups have played all sports in this country. It's the identity that I'm interested in. You can see there's evidence of certainly at this time, obviously Afrikaans schools then choosing rugby as their number one sport, not playing cricket, and vice versa. Football in this country, association football, is an interesting thing because we think of it as the Africans game, but actually, I mean, you probably remember in this country during apartheid there were 20,000, 30,000 watching, white crowd watching football. So we can simplify this idea that certain sports belong, but here this is more complex. I think because of the political aspect to it and the fact that there was certainly a purposeful move, not so much on the playing side, because I think that happened naturally, but at the top of the game. As I said, you can just see. I mean, the likes of Darnie Craven, I mean, he would be an amazing man to talk about this, wouldn't he? Now, if he could say it freely, because he wasn't actually a Bruin, but he would be dealing with these men that were. I mean, whether that was a conscious choice or whatever, I mean, I wouldn't know. But the political aspect of the game and how the identity of it. And let's face it, people have often tried to be too theoretical. Why did the Afrikaners choose rugby? Well, if you want to rub an adversary's nose in it, you're going to take on probably what is probably the most physical game in the world in terms of combat. You're not going to get good at cranking balls to teach you what's a lesson, you know. So I think that suited it as well. It's a legal way of roughing someone up, isn't it? I mean that's it. So you have this. They call sport war without guns. Rugby's the ultimate one. And that's why it makes it so fascinating and a game we love, because that is left on the pitch and then you have a point afterwards, and that's the thing. But with this stuff, that I remember just being quite naive at the time and asking people, I couldn't get my head around how this distinct way about it, the Springbok, what it represented, the culture, the folklore that surrounded it. especially being in Stellenbosch, of course, I realised I was in at the deep end. Maybe my journey would have taken a different line in UCT, but I'm sure I would have stumbled across this because this was significant.
Have you looked at the other way around? I mean, to take rugby to the scene, how it reinforced, if you like, you might call it sort of 50s nationalism that was there. Have you looked at the effect that 50s nationalism had on the way the rugby was played? You know, phrases like subdue and penetrate, which was one stage was the national tactic called stop and charge. Or even in one rugby, I mean, I get desperate when I watch 15 guys, half of them standing at the back, or 5 or 10 have yet another rolling ball. let's see if we can get it. It's like an old Roman testudo tortoise trying to literally bash out. I mean, it's, and if you compare that with aspects of the slightly more open, rugby, yes, it's war without guns, but it's also a game where you can win without being touched. And for some teams, that's the highest achievement of all.
But don't you think that comes with sport? I mean, again, generalising, it's an awful generalisation, but certain sports are played at the national level to mirror the so-called identity or the stereotype of that nation. Now, the way the British perceive South African rugby is bloody tough. It's skillful, but you're gonna have a battle. You're gonna go to war. I mean, that's the perception. It always has been. You can look at I don't know, the French. That's a good example. The French play with flair. You don't know what they're going to do. They can be all the best on their day. The other days they're awful. They'll play with this kind of freedom. You look at other sports, Brazilian football, Italian football. It's the national character.
Look at Wenger as against the sort of park the bus mentality of some of the.
Yeah. So I mean, we can kind of force that idea, that stereotype onto our sport. But what makes this more tangible is, I hope I've given a little bit of evidence there that evidence was that this was actually a purposeful way of.
I get that, and maybe what I'm doing is indulgently thinking into the future, because if 50s nationalism's kind of had its time in the sun, so to speak. You showed Sia Khaleesi, I don't know if you saw that recent clip of him. Two, I thought, really penetrating comments. The one was he felt was his view that Mandela would be anti-quota.
I saw that.
Point A, but point B, the much bigger point was if we're going to fix rugby, we're going to take food into townships, because when he got into a fully equipped school, he started getting 3 meals a day, which helped him play against children who were having 5 meals a day. You think about it, a kid who's having maybe 5 meals a week, playing against kids who get taken to school in the cities and have 5 meals a day, and so we have ice packs and
the problem with that is that the food, when you think of nutrition, if you only start getting decent food, when you happen to be picked at some fancy whatever,
because you've broken all the rules.
But unfortunately, you needed that nutrition as a baby up to about whatever.
But we still have this beautiful thing where we try to pick fruit on the apex of the orchard, and the concept of soil conservation was zero.
Exactly.
Cultivation.
In sports development, they call it the pyramid, don't they? I mean, if you have a wider based pyramid,
but if we can win at the top and stuff,
and that's the key to this, of course. I mean, the incredible, the talent that, I mean, I've seen it with my work with the community out at something crew. I think you mentioned that I've seen certainly 1 or 2 lads out there who play any sport, incredible talent, but physically they couldn't do it. Mentally, it's just the background and that kind of thing. It's opportunity where you are. But isn't that the case anywhere? I don't think that's just here in South Africa. That's certainly the case in the United Kingdom.
Sorry, but maybe you know. I've just read a book on Cristiano Ronaldo, and they were worried when he started. And it's a good story. He got to Lisbon as a 12-year-old. He was picked now to play. They were very worried about him because it was also Mama he lived on yogurt.
Came from here, didn't he?
Yes.
Ronaldo. He lives on more than your bed now.
In 16 and 17, there was definitely a dish in South Africa that was really back in the team. Jewish player who couldn't win. And that was a sort of feeling amongst the people aside. That's the first point. The second point is you can imagine how terrible it must be for Afrikaners today with quota systems. It must be awful for them to suddenly have to have old press people suddenly now having to be in their team. And even if they can't understand. And the last point I'd like to make is, in my observation, rugby in South Africa is dying. And you can notice this by going to dealers. Now, when a student goes to work on the gates for pocket money, and 4 clubs here have dealers as their home ground, UCT, Hamilton, False Bay, Villages. And on a Saturday afternoon, regularly there'd be 15,000 people watching club rugby. Okay. Now you go to dealers and watch Curry Cup game, be lucky if there are 15,000 people. Of the 15,000, quite a lot of them give them tickets for free to the guys that come along.
Yeah, but there's not just one reason. Obviously, the media hasn't helped. In other words, you can watch all of those games on TV, so if it's raining a bit outside, you think,
The content has been driven up. The game's become a product. It's gone from being a religious sport. When you talk about the religion in sport, I think you've got those the wrong way around. But once it becomes a product for pay TV, then Chris Baker will squeeze it until it's, he's preaching that
you see too many games. There's none of these 3 months tours.
The other point is only 4% of schools in South Africa play rugby. 4%. 4%. Now, I'm sure that includes Labour School or that Labour rugby that is coming on. But the other point is, if you go to the schools who play rugby, and Bishops was the first school to play rugby in South Africa, you go to Bishops, I'm giving the figures roughly, 1/3 of playing hockey, 1/3 of playing soccer, 1/3 of playing rugby. Graham and I went to school in Port Elizabeth, the same thing. The schools are playing other sports. In my time, Winting played rugby.
There was no choice. You went to play soccer.
Big thing is you
play hockey, you played rugby.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the big thing is you're talking about teams. My grandson, horror, does not play rugby.
Are you sure he's you?
You should. When I pictured the 1906 Springbok game, my great uncle was a four of them. It was a Morkel family. Morkels. They had numerous people. So now my daughter-in-law tells me my grandson can't play rugby because I want his neck broken. Now,